colleague, Kendra Brunig, back there filming us, so everybody looks beautiful, would like to welcome you to a wonderful ad hoc lecture, a wonderful lecture in our series of ad hocs, given to us by Liz Warren from South Mountain Community College. I'm going to speak a little bit about ACMRS and a little bit about Liz. ACMRS, most of you know, is a wonderful center which is open to you always with its activities which are interdisciplinary, cover the globe from the ancient Celtic world to the ancient Aztec world up until almost 1 year after the French Revolution, all over the globe. So we go all over the place. And if you have not been on our website, please go into www.acmrs.org and take a look at all of our wonderful events. Or you can go right back to the table that Kendra set up there and sign up on our sheet if you have not yet done so. That's an even easier way to receive news about our events. And if you are on our mailing list, you have received news about this fantastic event. And let me tell you a little bit, I'm going to give you a little bit of a personal introduction for Liz Warren, and she's going to Liz Warren has turned you into a politician as well. She's going to give you a magnificent rendering of the Grail story and all that it entails. I want to add a few personal things. I have had the great pleasure of working with Liz a few times, based on one time when I gave a lecture and Liz came to see me at the Irish Cultural Center. And since that time, I must tell you, Liz is somebody who I love working with because what she does with history and literature is the nicest thing I can say about any other lecturer, is to show that she loves it and to communicate her love for it to you. But apart from that, she is quite rigorous with her material. She does not make mistakes. She does not make slip-ups. She is that wonderful combination of an academic who is also someone who communicates the love of the material to you, and that is a gift. Some academics can do that, unfortunately, some cannot. And the kids who respond well in all university settings are those who have had teachers who are able to communicate the wonder of the material to them. Liz does that. I hope this is a wonderful introduction to you as well to the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. And you are greeted as well by our director, Professor Robert Bjork, who the only reason he's not here, Liz, is because he's teaching. So while he complies with his teaching duties and helps to inspire students in the classroom, here we are in another classroom, and Liz is going to give you a wonderful combination of storytelling, myth, and historical context. Welcome to what is going to be a magnificent lecture. Come story, come enlightenment on the Holy Grail story.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Sharona, for that beautiful introduction. Those are the things that I aspire to do. As Sharona said, actually I don't think she said this part, I'm the director of the Storytelling Institute at South Mountain Community College, and I've been a storyteller for over 20 years. And for the first 12 years of my life as a storyteller, I was completely immersed in the story of the Grail. I am not a Renaissance or medieval scholar. I don't have any degrees in literature or medieval history. My degrees are in anthropology, and of course I'm a storyteller. But I spent many years researching and thinking about this story to develop the version that parts of which I'm going to tell you today. So before I start telling you some of the highlights of the story, I want to tell you a little bit about the story, about the version that I prefer. There's not something else. And a little bit about the scope of the story, how it's played out through the ages. It's obviously been present in our life and imagination for many centuries, and it's been part of written literature since the 12th century. We think that the first person to write it down, we pretty much know the first person to write it down, was Chrétien de Troyes. And he wrote this probably before 1190, Some people say he died in 1185, some people say he died in 1190, but right around there, his book, Arthurian Romances, was published. And the values that are expressed in this oldest version, Chrétien's version, are still hugely relevant to us today. Now, I don't believe that's necessarily true of later versions of this story, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that right now. So I would rather just tell you the whole story, but I do want to give you some of this background. So let's start with a kind of a rough timeline for the story. Now, it's based in Celtic mythology, and it's based in a Welsh myth that can be found in the Mabinogion, which the story is called Peredur. And Peredur was a knight, and he went in search of something called a Grail, G-R-A-A-L. And when the Grail in Peredur's story was brought out, it didn't serve anybody or emit light. It was carrying a severed head. Now all that's all very Celtic. You know, they were all about the head, right? And the severed head, you know, was they threw them in lakes, and that was power, and the power all came from the head. So that was symbolic. Here's on the tray, here's the head, the symbol of everything that they valued, right? That was Peredur. It's a very confusing story. I can't believe that anybody, even in those days, told it the way that it eventually got written down, because it doesn't. Or it's just an example of all the cultural knowledge that's been lost that makes it impossible for us to understand how it could have been told in that way. So anyway, Chrétien comes along in the 12th century. He was probably the Michael Jackson of his day, is what I'm telling you. He was fantastically well educated. He served in the courts of Marie de Champagne, she of courtly love, and Eleanor of Aquitaine. And he was the troubadour. He invented that role in court of the trouvère, the troubadour, right? So we know he was an oral storyteller and a musician. And then eventually he got around to writing these things down. In his story, the character in this story is called Percival. In Chrétien's version, he's called Percival the Welshman. So we know that Chrétien, in that way, is giving reference to the source of the story, that it came from the Welsh story. His medieval listeners would have understood that perfectly. Brittany was still Celtic in its nature in those days. The storytellers that were flooding throughout France and England were coming at that time primarily from Brittany. Chrétien would have known them. He probably studied with them. So this is a continuation of that Welsh tradition. We know that for Chrétien. Now, Chrétien wrote his book, Arthurian Romances, which I have right here. I brought it because I just love it so much, and you can see that it's been loved almost to death. Five stories that people say, with this book, Chrétien did two things. He created the genre of Arthurian literature, and he simultaneously gave us a snapshot of the highest values and expression of French chivalry in the 12th century. A lot of what we know about the values of that time and for those people, we know because of Chrétien. But Chrétien died, and he died, as it happened, about 7/8 of the way through the story that I'm going to tell you today, the story of the Grail. It's unfinished. And this it was still hugely popular because he was so hugely popular and so well known. And so after he died, there came a whole century, literally, of what are known as the continuators. And one of the first continuators was Robert de Baron, who wrote, his story was called Joseph of Arimathea. Let me just remind myself what he is the first person to actually use the word the Grail. His story is not as well known, his version is not as well known as that of the next continuator, Wolfram von Eschenbach, who was a German. For many people, his Parsifal is the best of this genre. Joseph Campbell, for example, felt that Wolfram's version was the best. I don't agree. I still prefer Chrétien's version because it is closer to its Celtic roots. After Wolfram, we have maybe one or a collection of Christian writers. And they were monks or priests or in some way most likely embedded in the structure of the church. And we know this because of the change in values that the quest for the Holy Grail, which was the next continuation, brings about. So then, you know, after those three, those guys in that century, then we get to Mallory, and then we get to Wagner, and then we get to Eliot, and then we get to White, who wrote Once and Future King, and then we get to Camelot in the 60s, and Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and then we get to Indiana Jones, exactly right. So, we all laugh because they're funny, but think about it. Those movies are hugely expensive, are they not? We are putting tons of cultural resources to the production and maintenance of that story. When somebody decides to make a movie about it, it's not a small thing. We're saying, oh yeah, we value that. And we're going to put millions of dollars to making sure that that story is still out there. So it's important that what happens to these stories as they go on through time. Now we know that what happened with Wagner's story was tragic in some way. So for many people, the story of the Grail, and in particular the primary character, Parzival, whatever you call him, is a person of, maybe the most generous thing you can say, we feel ambiguous, right, about the way that the story is told. So, but that's not so much the case in Chrétien. In Chrétien's story, he is a rube, he is young, he is foolish, he is untested. But by the end of it, he becomes a real man. So there's nothing to feel ambivalent about. In some ways, it's a very common story, right? It's about becoming a whole person. Now, the other reason that I love Chrétien is that he represents the bridge between the oral versions of the story and the literate versions of the story. And he also represents the bridge between the purely Celtic versions of the story and the Christianized version of the story. Now, Chrétien was a Christian, and when you read the book, you can hardly get through it for all the invocations of God. Right? Every time a character speaks, they say, well, may God bless me when I say this, and may God do this, and may God do that. But the values that underlie the story, they are not Christian. They're Celtic. This is the two things that it's about. And this is why I think the story is still relevant for us today. The first thing that the story is about what happens to your world when masculine and feminine values are out of balance. And the consequences that we pay individually, socially, and in the land when masculine and feminine values are out of balance. Huge theme in this story. We could stop right there. The other thing that's important about this story, and especially important for us today, is that the hero's task is not one of physical strength. Does he manifest that physical strength and prowess and courage again and again and again? Yes, he does. But his initial failure, and the thing that he has to do to redeem himself, is an act of speech. His heroic task is to speak at the right time, with the right intention. Now, I can hardly think of two things that are more relevant to us today than the mismatch in masculine and feminine values in our culture and the need to speak with courage and intent at the right time. This is actually something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. With the recent changes in our political environment, I realized I was afraid that I wouldn't have the courage to speak or act at the right time. And I have been talking with people about this, and I know that this is on many people's mind. Or how do we know? There's so many things we could potentially speak about. How do we choose? How do we know what to do? What Chrétien tells us is that we must be mindful of the moment. We must be on watch for that moment. And when we see the opportunity, we must speak from our heart with intent. He says, he doesn't say it explicitly, but through the structure of his story, he shows us that that is the heroic act. That is the most important heroic act. So, Chrétien bridging oral and literate, Celtic and Christian. Wolfram, then, bridges that Chrétien's more Celtic version with a more Christian version. The other important thing that happens there, in Chrétien's version, it's truly about honoring the feminine and what happens when it's out of balance. Every subsequent version moves farther and farther away from that. Wolfram still is all about honoring the feminine. But by the time you get that version the monks wrote, The Quest for the Holy Grail, guess what? It's the woman's fault. And then in every subsequent version, in Mallory, who's to blame for all the problems? Guinevere, right? And poorly, and bad men, right? That can't resist something so trifling as the most beautiful woman in the world. So, and then ever after, we never get that back. The problems are always come down to the feminine, rather than the problem being a mismatch of the energies being out of balance, masculine and feminine. I would never tell those stories. It just makes me so mad, right? that was a choice, clearly, that they made. These guys aren't stupid. They were the Nobel Prize winners of their time. These were the genius literature guys of the time. They chose to make women the bad guy, so to speak. The problem, so to speak. Now, in fairness, that was completely in keeping with the values of their time. All right, so I've told you that he served in the courts of Marie de Champagne and Eleanor Aquitaine, and he was the inventor of Arthurian literature, and I've told you what I think the two main things that this story is about. So now what I'd like to do is tell you some of my favorite parts of the story. It would normally take me about an hour to 75 minutes to tell this story. I'm going to see if I can tell you my favorite parts in about half an hour so that we have time to talk about it when I'm done. I'm just going to check and see how I'm doing on time before I start that. Oh, good. All right, we may get through more of it than I thought. One of the ways, I'm not going to do this now, but one of the ways to tell how different these stories are is to look at the opening lines. And Chrétien's opening line is this. He says, "It was the season when trees flower, when shrubs leaf out, when meadows go green, when birds, each in their own voice, sing sweetly, and all is aflame with joy." Now, that is an optimistic opening, is it not? Right. Well, you go to Wolfram, and right away it's about, hey, you guys are screwing up around here, and you better get on track. I mean, and then I don't even know about the Quest for the Holy Grail. I couldn't make myself look at it today. But I thought just the contrast between Chrétien and Wolfram is so telling. Because in that first line of Chrétien's, he tells you, oh, we're in spring. We're in birth. We're in rebirth. We're in optimism, beauty, renewal. And that's very important to Chrétien. He's ultimately an optimistic person. So, it was the season when trees flower, when shrubs leaf out, when meadows go green, and birds, each in their own voice, sing sweetly in the morning, and all was aflame with joy. It was spring. It was also the season of King Arthur, that glorious chivalric time when many people believed that humanity was at its greenest and most verdant as well. But in the midst of all that beauty, of all that flowering and greenness and hope, there was a wasteland of death and destruction. And it was creeping ever closer to Arthur and his court. And on the edge of that wasteland, there was a farm. And that farm was owned by a widow woman. And she had lost her husband and her 2 older sons to knightly pursuit in the service of King Arthur. And she swore that her remaining son, her dear one, would not suffer the same fate. So he grew up in complete ignorance of the world around him. He knew nothing about King Arthur. He knew nothing about chivalry, knights. He knew nothing about society beyond that farm. He knew nothing about religion, nothing. And his mother had placed a strict ban on the mention of this to all of the farmers, her servants, all the people who worked for her, knew they were not to mention anything of them. Now that would be like growing up now and nobody ever mentioning Barack Obama. It was that kind of thing. So he grew up in complete happiness. His mother's farm was beautiful and green, and they had all they needed to eat and to live. And he grew up strong and healthy and handsome and ignorant. And one day he was out hunting. He used javelins to hunt. When thundering down the road came 5 enormous knights right through his mother's land. And at first he thought they were devils because the sound was so awful. But when they got closer and he saw the beauty of their armor and their pennants and the breeze, he thought, these are angels. And he threw himself on the ground. They had to pull their horses up to not trample him in the ground. Well, now they had intended to ask him questions. They were seeking knights who had abducted a maiden. But right away he jumped up and started asking them questions. What are you? Did God make you this way? How? What? When? Well, the knight in charge said, well, no, of course God did not make us this way. We are knights. King Arthur made us. King Arthur? Who is this? So he learned in this way all about Arthur and knights. And of course, he was smitten in an instant. When those knights finally were able to get away from him and continue their pursuit, he rushed back to his mother to tell her what had happened. Mother, mother, I've met knights. I've learned about King Arthur. I'm going to be knighted by King Arthur myself. Boom, down on the ground. She fell dead in a faint. Now, she had never told him of his history. So she said, no, 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 you cannot go. You can't do this. Here's why. Your father, your brothers, they all died in service of King Arthur. I cannot lose you too. But he didn't hear any of that. He wasn't even really paying attention. She was just talking like she always did. He said, Mother, I don't think you understand. I'm going. I'm going. Well, after a few days of arguing, she realized he was going. And she realized her only hope was to make him look as foolish and coarse as he really was. So she gave him rough clothing, and she made him shoes, leather buskins, Chrétien calls them. She gave him her oldest nag and a bad saddle. And she put him on there, and she said, now son, you know nothing of the world, so I have to give you some advice. He said, yes, Mother, I'm listening. She said, first of all, you must always respect ladies and women. All honor comes to the man who respects women. She said, now, I know that the ladies are going to find you very attractive, and they're going to be coming up to you. He was very good looking, tall, broad shoulders, blonde hair, blue eyes, gorgeous. And she said, they're gonna want to know you better. She said, now, if a lady wants to give you a kiss, you may accept that kiss. And if she has a ring and she wants to give you that ring as a token of her affection, you may take that, but no more. Yes, Mother. She said, now, always seek out the company of gentlemen. A gentleman will never steer you astray. If you need help, you can go to a gentleman. Yes, Mother? And finally, she said, always go into churches and commend yourself and me to God. Mother, what is a church? Oh, she said, well, a church. Churches are the big, beautiful buildings you will see on your travels. He said, I will do that, Mother. You and me, commended. Got it. Well, the moment came, he turned his horse and he rode away from his mother's farm. There was a little bridge that ran over a river, separating his mother's farm from the rest of the world. When he got across that bridge, he looked back and he saw that his mother had fainted again. And her servants were all around her. And a part of him said, oh, I should go back. But then he thought, she's always fainting. And he went on down the road. And in short order, many gentlemen were asked for help. Many ladies were helped who did not need help. Many attractive buildings that were not churches were entered. And on the second day, he came upon what really was the most beautiful building he had ever seen. In a little meadow, a striped tent. Blue, gold, scarlet, gleaming in the sunlight. He said, this is really beautiful. By far the most beautiful thing I've seen. This has got to be a church. So he rode his horse right in, but of course it wasn't a church. It was a lady's respite. And there she lay on a pallet of silks and coverlets, barely clad. And when she came, he rode right in on his horse, and she said, "What are you doing, trying to cover herself up?" "Oh!" And when she did that, held her hand up, he noticed she had a ring, a beautiful ring. His mother said he could take rings. So he got off his horse, went over there, grabbed her hand, started playing the ring off of it while she screamed and cried. He said, "Maiden, I have no idea why you're protesting. My mother said this is exactly how I should treat ladies." And since he had her hands in his hands, and he was already quite close to her, he began kissing her because she was really quite beautiful, and she complained even more and cried. Again he said, "Maiden, I'm only doing what my mother advised." Finally he gave up. She fell back on her bed, weeping away. He noticed some beautiful meat pies and a jug of wine there that she had laid out for her husband. He hadn't bothered to ask, and they looked really good, and he was hungry, so he ate them up. And then she was still crying. He said, "I'm so sorry that you're unhappy, maiden," and he left. Well, the next day, the widow's son, her dear one, came up over a hill, and he looked down in the valley, and he saw a huge complex of beautiful buildings. And because he had been asking everyone along the way about how to get to Arthur's court, he knew this was it. And he rode right up, and as he was about to go over the drawbridge, a huge knight in red armor came thundering out. The widow's son was dazzled by this. He was so beautiful. And as he passed this dear one, he threw him a goblet and said, "Are you going to King Arthur?" And the widow's son said, yes, I am." "Well, take him that goblet and said, if there's a man in there man enough to fight me, I await that person." That was all the entry our dear one needed. He rode his horse right into the court. There was the big round table surrounded by all these men, each one more handsome than the last. He didn't know which one was King Arthur. A page came over and he asked, and the page said, "Oh, it's that one. He's the one that looks a little sad today. See, he's wearing a velvet cap." "Thank you," said our dear one, and he rode his horse around right up to King Arthur. Said, "Excuse me, sir, I'm here to be knighted." Arthur did not look at him. "King Arthur, if that's who you are, I'm here to be knighted, and if I'm going to be knighted, I would like that red armor I just saw." Again, Arthur said nothing. Well, our dear one was impatient. He said, "This king never made any knights." And he turned his horse to leave, but he'd ridden up so closely that his horse's nose knocked Arthur's cap right off of his head. And then Arthur came out of his reverie. "Oh, excuse me, brother, excuse me. Yes, of course you've come to the right place. It's just that I'm such a funk over what happened just now. The Red Knight came in here. He stole the cup out of Guinevere's hand, spilled the wine on her. She's in a deadly fury. I don't know if she will recover." "Yes, sir, I have that goblet right here. He awaits your champion. And by the way, I would like to have that red armor." Well, this is when Arthur's foster brother Kay spoke up. Kay, the meddlesome one. "Why, yes, you should be the champion. Arthur will knight you. Go get that armor for yourself." Well, that was all he needed to hear. He turned and he rode out of there before anyone could stop him. Arthur was most displeased with this, though. He said, "Kay, anyone could see that despite that boy's foolish appearance, he was of noble bearing. He could have been a good knight. But now he will surely be killed, and it's all down to you." But of course, our dear one knew nothing of this. He rode right out to the Red Knight, and the Red Knight says, "Is Arthur sending his champion?" Our dear one says, "Yep, it's me. Give me that armor. Arthur has given me your armor." The Red Knight thought to himself, "Things are worse in this kingdom than I realized." He didn't even bother with the business end of his lance. He just picked it up by the middle, and with the butt end of it, boom, he popped our dear one, and he fell right off his horse onto the ground. But this enraged him. So furious, humiliated, he had his javelins with him. Without even thinking about it, he picked up one of those javelins and he pitched it at that Red Knight. Now, he had been hunting with javelin for many years. That javelin went right through the visor in the Red Knight's helmet. right through his eye, right through his brain. There's a clang when the tip of it hit the back of the helmet, and the Red Knight fell off his horse in a gush of brains and blood. He was dead. The widow's son said, "Wow, this knightly business is not as difficult as I thought it was going to be." He got off his own horse, though, and the hard part was he didn't know how to get that armor off. And he was just about thinking he was going to have to cut that Red Knight out of the armor to get it for himself, when the same page who helped him to begin with came rushing out. Helped him get the armor off, cleaned it up, got it on him, helped him get on the Red Knight's beautiful red horse. And as he was getting ready to leave, the widow's son said, "Oh, would you hand me my javelins, please?" And the page said, "No, I will not. We know you are ignorant, but that is not a proper tool for a knight or a gentleman." And he handed him the sword and the lance and the shield. And he took off down the road. Now at this point, Chrétien tells us all about how our dear one, the widow's son, meets his true mentor, an old knight in the service of King Arthur, and about the role of this beautiful red war horse. Now we know that medieval audiences would have completely understood the symbolism of the horse and of the color red, that it represented power, the potential for violence. This was a war. This was an instrument of war, this horse. It would be like being given an armored Humvee today or something. That's what these kind of horses represented. Now later in the story, our dear one, the widow's son, will get a black horse. And the medieval audiences would have understood what that meant as well, that meant his maturity, his switch to a later phase of his life and of understanding. But at this point, that red horse is his only friend. And it's a good thing it knew where it was going and what to do, because he didn't know what to do. And it rode right up to his future mentor's castle, and when his knights saw him coming, they thought it was the Red Knight. And they came out in some alarm, but they only had to trade a few sentences with the current occupant of that armor to understand that this was indeed a new Red Knight. He could not stop talking about his mother, about King Arthur, about what he had seen, about how the lance went through the eyeball, everything that happened. And when he met the old knight that accepted him in and trained him, that old knight could see through this foolishness to that noble baron. And he took him on and he trained him. Chrétien uses this beautiful line to describe our dear one, the widow's son. He said, "Nature was his teacher, and his heart was set upon it, and nothing for which nature and his heart strove could be difficult." That is a line that I often think of, because that is what I would strive for in my own life, is to find that thing for which nature and our heart has come together. I love that line. So within a matter of weeks, he's trained as a knight, because he's ready for it. And when he's done and ready to go, his old mentor says, "Please stay here. Please marry my daughter." But even as untested as he was, he knew he had to earn a wife. He couldn't be given a wife, and he said as much. And he said, "Besides, I need to go back and check on my mother. The last time I saw her, she was dead away in a faint. I need to tell her what's happened to me and that I've been knighted, and about you." And he said, "That is a good impulse. That is a good impulse," said the mentor. "But before you go, my son, I must give you some advice." And the mentor says, "Now, you are skilled and you are strong. You will often be the victor. Spare life when you can. Show mercy." Our dear one said he would. He said, "Secondly, you must always show respect to women and ladies. And you must always go into churches and commend yourself to God." He said, "That is exactly what my mother told me. My mother said exactly those same things." And the mentor said, "That brings me to my third point. You have got to stop talking about your mother." It just makes you look foolish. And the other thing he said, you have got to stop asking so many questions. Now, I know you had a lot to learn, but those days are over. Knights do not ask questions, said the mentor. People come to knights and ask them questions, and knights give the answers. Do not ask so many questions. That time is past for you. And our dear one said that he understood, and he rode away. Well now, he had no idea where he was, where he'd come from, or where he was going to. He really had no idea how to get back to his mother's home. So as he had when he left King Arthur's castle, he just let that big red war horse lead him on. And that war horse led him to another castle that was in a pitiful state of despair. And soon enough, our dear one realizes, or comes to know when he's brought into the castle, that this castle is owned by a beautiful young queen, Blanchefleur. And she has been besieged by a neighboring knight who wants to marry her for her lands. And all of her knights have been killed or have been weakened because he hasn't let any food come in there for weeks and weeks. So Percival, of course, falling in love with her, says that he will defend her. And he does. As each knight comes, he defeats him, remembers his mentor's advice, doesn't kill them, sends them to King Arthur to do their service. Until finally the besieging knight himself is defeated and sent off to King Arthur, and his beautiful Blanchefleur is free. She makes it clear to him that she would welcome him as her husband and as the king there. And again he says, no, no, I could never get married without my mother. And I must find her. You understand that, don't you? I'll bring her here with us, and then we'll be married. And Blanchefleur, it wasn't her first rodeo. And she said, I love you, and I will wait for you, but I do not believe it is going to be as simple as you think it is to find your mother. But of course you must go, and I will wait. And they each pledged to the other that they would be true until they met again. And Percival left. Again, no idea where he was, no idea where he was going. He just let that red horse take its lead. They traveled for many days. And each day, they got deeper and deeper into the wasteland. And there was more death, more devastation. It looked as though it hadn't rained in years in the part of the countryside that they were in. And late one day, Percival, his horse really, had been leading them on a path up a rocky side of a hill. Below them was a river, brown, turgid, murky, ugly river. And he got to a point where they ran out of path. And he couldn't back up. And there was only hill above and ugly river below, and he didn't know what to do. And just then, on that horrible river, came floating a little boat. Two people, one rowing, the other fishing. And the one who was fishing was very, very richly dressed, clearly a king. And he called down to them and said, "Can you help me, please? I don't know what to do. My horse can't go forward and I can't go backward." And that fisherman looked up and said, "Why, yes, of course I can help you." He said, "Just urge your horse on a little farther, and the path will open up before you. You must have faith. And in a few steps you'll see off to your left, you'll see my home and I will meet you there. Please join me for the evening." And the boat went on down the river, and our dear one, despite his misgivings, urged his horse onward, and it was just as that man had said. Somehow magically the path opened up beneath the hooves of this great red war horse. A few more steps, there was a bridge across the river. He went over it, but he didn't see any castle. And he thought, this is strange, and he looked away to try and get his bearings, and when he looked back, whoosh, the mist had separated, and there was a beautiful castle. The drawbridge was lowered, he rode right in. Everyone seemed to be expecting him. They seemed happy to see him, which he thought was odd. They didn't know he was coming. They helped him off the horse into some clean clothing and led him into a beautiful hall. In the center of that hall was an open fireplace, open on all four sides, and on one side of it, there was that man he had seen in the boat. He thought, how did he already get it? He was on a pile of cushions, wearing a fur robe, and he clearly was in pain. And when he walked over to him, his host said, "Please forgive me, my wound prevents me from rising to greet you." And our dear one wanted to ask, what kind of wound would prevent that? Would prevent him from getting up? But he remembered what his mentor had said, and he asked nothing. He did not want to appear foolish. Well, they sat down, and it wasn't long after that that night fell, and more people started coming into the hall. And once it was completely dark, the widow's son noticed a door on the other side of the hallway came open, and out of that doorway came an amazing procession. It was led by two very handsome young men, each carrying enormous silver candelabras. Behind them was another man, a warrior, carrying a white lance, and from the tip of that white lance ran drops of blood down the lance and over that knight's hand. Oh, he wanted to ask about that. What is that? He didn't. The third member of the procession was a beautiful woman. Without a doubt, the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Her beauty was radiant and complex, and of course, individual to her, but at the same time, he knew that in her beauty, he was seeing the beauty of all women, of Blanchefleur, of Guinevere, of the ladies in the court, of his own mother. That was the complexity, the completeness of the beauty of this woman. She was holding a grail in her hands, and from that grail was emitted a bright golden light. And she walked right past him and that rich fisherman. That whole procession went around the fireplace twice, came right in front of him twice. He was dying to ask about it. But he remembered what his mentor had said, and he didn't want to dishonor his memory. He didn't want to be a bad man and appear foolish. So he said nothing. Well, the Grail was set on a table, and one by one everyone came up and was fed from it whatever they most loved to eat or drink, the widow's son included. And it was the most amazing feast that he had ever witnessed. And he wanted to ask about that too. But he didn't, and the night wore on. And that air of expectancy which had met him when he arrived began to dissipate. And soon the whole room felt flat, almost disappointed somehow, but he couldn't understand why that would be. Finally, the rich fisherman said, well, I must bid you good night now. I must be carried to my bed, and you'll be shown to your room, and this is what happened. And he spent a very, very fitful, uncomfortable night. He couldn't get comfortable. He couldn't sleep. He could not stop seeing those images of that procession. The light from that Grail still filled his dreams and his imagination. He woke up very early, but he didn't hear anything. So he went back to sleep, and when he woke up, he realized it was late morning. And when he got up and went out, everyone was gone. It was empty. His horse was saddled and ready. His armor was there. No one was there. He rode out across the drawbridge. He was just about to go onto land when suddenly that drawbridge started coming up, and he knew somebody had to still be in there. Hey, what's going on? He called out. The horse had to jump to not fall into the moat. But on the other side, he could see the prints of many horses' hoofprints, so he knew that they had in fact gone. And he went on down the road, and he turned to look back, as he always did. No castle. Gone. He went down the road, not too far at all, and he came upon a young woman who was holding the body of a man in her lap. In short order, he learned that this woman was in fact his cousin. And he learns this when she says to him, "What is your name?" He says, "Well, I'm not sure. My mother calls me her dear one. I'm known as the Red Knight, but I think my name is Percival." She said, "Percival? Well, I am your cousin. You do not remember me, but I spent a lot of time at your mother's house when you were small. And you appear to be rested and fed. There's no castle around here." He said, "Well, of course there is. There's one right around the corner." She said, "If you've been at a castle, then you have been at the home of the Fisher King." He said, "Well, he was a fisher and he appeared wealthy. I didn't know he was a king." "Yes, he's a king. So you were there. You were there." He said, "Yes, I was." "Well, did you ask?" "Ask what?" "Well, you met him, right? Did you ask about his wound?" "No." "What about the lance?" "No." "You saw the Grail, didn't you?" "Yes, I did." "You didn't ask about that either, did you?" She said, "Well then, let me tell you this. His wound is the source of the blight that you see around you. His wound is the source of the wasteland. If you had asked, you could have healed that. But you didn't. You couldn't bring yourself to do that. I'm ashamed to call you my cousin. And she didn't speak another word to her. And he left her. He went on down the road and he came upon another woman. This one, so pitiful. Her hair matted. She had on a thin garment that was almost shredded, and she was trying to keep it on her body, but every time she pulled on it, another rip or tear appeared. Well, this was surely somebody he could help. And he went up to her and said, "Maiden, can I help you?" And when she looked up at him, she said, "You of all people cannot help me." Well, it turns out that this was the lady from the tent that he had met on his first day after he left the farm. She was married, and when her husband came back and found her ring gone and his food eaten, he did not accept her explanation that she had only been kissed, that she had been assaulted. Just about that time, that husband himself came crashing through the brush and announced to Percival that he would kill him, but first he would explain this woman's offenses. He said, "I know men. No man would stop at kissing. She's lying, and I know she didn't just have that ring taken. She gave it. She liked that attention." And then they fought. And as Percival always did, he was the victor. And as he held his sword over the husband's throat, he said, "Will you die or will you take instruction?" "I will take instruction." So he explained to him that everything his wife had said was true, because he was that coarse youth who had done these things. And he made him promise to bring her back to health, to assure her of his love, and then to give himself over to the service of King Arthur. And then they departed. Now, when this man and his wife finally appeared at King Arthur's court, this was the 20th or 30th guy that the Red Knight had sent to King Arthur. And Arthur said, "Oh, how did we let this Red Knight out of our grasp? He is clearly my greatest knight, and I don't even know who he is. He is not sitting around my table. We must find him." And so Arthur decreed that the entire court would go on a road trip. And they loaded up, and they went out, and they camped night after night, looking for Percival himself. But of course, Percival didn't know this. One morning, Percival got up, and it had snowed in the night. He got on his horse, and he was riding down the road, and he noticed that a hawk attacked a goose. The goose got away, but a few of its drops of blood fell in the snow. And when he went over and he looked at the snow and the blood drops in the snow melting, it reminded him of the blush in the cheek of his beautiful Blanchefleur, and he went into a love trance. Well, as it happened, he was right on the edge of Arthur's encampment. And when they woke up and saw this enormous knight just waiting there, they were alarmed. And they set out night after night, but Percival's love trance was not broken. Fortunately, the horse was not on the love trance. And so as each knight came forward, just at the right moment, the horse would turn and the lance would knock the knight off. Eventually, Sir Gawain, Arthur's favorite, and a guy who knew a thing or two about a love trance, said, I think there's something else going on here. And he didn't put on his own armor, he just went out and he looked. And he followed Percival's gaze to the snow, and he saw the blood in the snow there, and the pinkish hue it had made, and he said, "Yep, love trance." Yeah. He threw his cloak over it, and when Percival's gaze was broken, well, he said, "Well, good morning. Who are you, and what are you doing here?" All of the introductions were made. They find out this is the man that they have been looking for. Arthur immediately decrees 7 days and 7 nights of feasting. And Percival starts to have a good time, and he thinks, well, maybe it wasn't so bad what happened. Maybe it wasn't so bad what my cousin said about my failure. They all seem to like me here. Maybe I can stay here and join this court. And let's just see how it goes. He was feeling okay about himself for the first time in a long time. But as these stories go, there's a but coming, a big but coming, right? On that 7th night of feasting, right into the hall came the most hideous woman Percival had ever seen. She was on a sickly yellow mule. Her skin was covered with lesions and weeping sores. She had teeth that looked more like tusks than teeth, a piggy nose, little piggy eyes, hair in 2 braids like twisted iron, but her eyes, those little piggy eyes, were very bright and sharp. Everyone gasped as she rode that sickly mule right into the center of Arthur's court there in the field. No one recognized her except Arthur himself. And he arose and he said, "Welcome to you, country. You are always welcome in my home, anytime." She turned and she looked at him and she said, "Well, I wish I could give you the same kind of welcome. But I cannot, and I will not. As long as you have a person like that in your company." And she pointed right at Percival. And they all turned and they all gasped. She said to Arthur, "Do you know who that is?" He said, "Well, yes, I do. That's Sir Percival, the Red Knight. I count him amongst my best knights." "Oh, do you?" "Well, do you know he was at the Grail Castle? Do you know he saw the lance? Do you know he met the king? He saw the Grail, and he could not ask one thing. He could not open his mouth." And she turned and addressed Percival directly. "How about now? Anything to say now?" And he still could not speak. And she said, "Well, since you still cannot speak, let me tell you the consequences of your action. Because you could not speak, the wasteland will deepen. Ladies will lose their husbands. The suffering in this land will increase, all because of you." Then she turned to everyone else and she said, "Is there anybody here man enough to go find that Grail Castle, to find that Grail King, for that is who he is, and ask the question that will restore our land to its proper balance, to the beauty that we know that we all deserve, the peace, the understanding? Can anyone do that?" And one by one, all of those knights said, "Yes, I will, I will, no, I will, I will." They got up. Arthur said, "You can't all go," but they all went. And Percival, he swore a different oath. He swore that he would not spend any 2 nights in the same place until he again returned to that castle and asked that question. And he stayed true to that vow for many, many years. And his life became a routine of fighting, sleeping in the rough, foraging for food, day after day after day, for years. He forgot why he was doing it. He forgot again who he was. So lost in this routine he became. But as chance would have it, he met a knight one day on a big black horse, and when they fought on the edge of a precipice, his own beautiful red horse tumbled down. His neck was broken and he died. The knight escaped up the other side of the ravine, so there was Percival left with this big black horse. And there was nothing he could do but get on it and ride. And shortly after that, he had an opportunity to spend several days in the home of a holy hermit. And in very short order, he started to pour his heart out to the hermit. All the things that had happened, his life up until then. And his confessor, this hermit, said to him, "Who are you, my son?" And he said, "Well, I'm known as the Red Knight, but my name is Percival." And the man gasped. He said, "Well, I have news for you that is going to grind your failure even more deeply into your heart." And Percival said, "What could you possibly say that would make this worse for me?" He said, "Well, I'm sorry to tell you that I am your uncle. I am your mother's brother. And that day when you left and thought she had fainted, she had in fact died. And I must also tell you that that rich fisherman, that Grail King that you met, he is also your uncle. My brother, your mother's brother. And let me tell you how he came to be that way. He's always been the Grail King, but he went out on a mission of vengeance, which I don't need to tell you a Grail King should not do. And he was wounded in a great battle, and a lance went through the tops of both of his thighs, and the tip of it broke off. And all the best surgeons were called for, and they finally dug that tip out of his thigh, but he was never able to be healed after that. All the best scholars, prophets, seers were called for, and finally it became clear that the only way he would be healed was if a knight, a particular knight, came and asked a healing question. And then you came, but you did not ask. And so his suffering and all our suffering has increased. Well, Percival finally broke down and just cried. And cried and cried. He stayed with his uncle for many weeks, breaking his vow to never stay more than any 2 nights in one place. And it was finally time for them to separate. His uncle prayed for him for peace and forgiveness and said that he thought that he would have better luck. And Percival took out again and traveled on, they say maybe for many more years. But his traveling now was different. They say he learned the seasons of the sun and the cycles of the moon. And that not every encounter ended in somebody's death. And after many years, he and that black horse found themselves in a familiar place. They were on a rocky precipice that was getting narrower and narrower above a murky river. Percival barely let himself hope that he was in the right place. But again, he got to that point where the horse could go no further. And he looked down on the river, and again there was coming a boat. But this time in the boat, only Kundry. And he turned away from her and said, "I know I do not have the right to look upon you." And she said, "That is not true. You have earned this second chance. It's just as before. Urge your horse forward. The path will open up, and I will meet you in the castle." And so he did. He urged that horse on, and the path opened up just as the hoof came down. And in a few more steps, he could see the bridge. He went across the bridge, and at first he did not see the castle, but this time he did not look away. And it appeared before him. The drawbridge lowered. He raced into that castle, jumped off of his horse, said, "Where is my uncle? Take me to my uncle." And he was led up to his uncle, who was so ill he could barely raise a hand, his skin so pale as to be almost translucent. He fell by his uncle's side and said, "Uncle, what ails thee? What is wrong with you? Whom does the Grail serve if it does not serve to aid in your healing?" And as these questions came tumbling out of his broken, open heart, the color began to return to his uncle's cheeks. And by the time he had finished these questions that he had worried so much about, his uncle stood. And the two of them raced to the window in time to see a tidal wave of green sweeping over the wasteland. Trees flowering, birds beginning to sing. He was certain he hadn't heard the song of a bird since he left his mother's house. He turned and saw that Kundry was next to him, and that as the green was sweeping the land, she too was transforming from her hideous aspect into the Grail maiden. When he saw that, he fell on his knees before her. She said, "Percival, when you ask a heartfelt question, the right question at the right time, from your own heart, unbidden, you bring healing. That is what you have done here. You earned your second chance. You have asked the question. And now you will succeed your uncle. You will be the Grail King." And that's exactly what happened. Now that his poor uncle had been healed, he was able to die, and he did. And Percival did become the Grail King. And Blanchefleur came, and they were married, and they lived there for many years in happiness, and they say that the world was green and imbalanced and verdant for many, many years. But King Arthur and his court, they never really came together in the same way that they had been before. Never again, never at any time. So now, when the trees flower, and the shrubs leaf out, and the meadows go green, and all is aflame with joy, that's the time that we remember Percival and Arthur and the story of the Grail.